This is the class, Why Four Gospels, and this is topic 2, Parallels and Differences in Meanings. Parallels and Differences in Meanings, and this is video 1. As we have seen in the previous videos, the four accounts of the mission and ministry of Jesus in our New Testament, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were written obviously by different authors representing different faith communities. And these accounts of Jesus, accounts of his mission and ministry, his life, death, and resurrection, emerged from within particular faith communities and were written to these communities. So one reason they are different, the four accounts are different, is that the communities from which these accounts emerged were composed of different people with different concerns and different needs and different traditions. Early disciples of Jesus did not all believe the same things or practice their faith the same way. For example, the early Jewish followers of Jesus continued to observe Jewish customs and traditions and considered themselves Jews. Most non-Jews, when they became followers of Jesus, did not adopt Jewish customs and traditions. So it should not be surprising then that Jewish followers of Jesus and non-Jewish followers of Jesus would have different concerns and would interpret the meaning of Jesus in different ways. Clearly, there were beliefs and practices which they held in common, but also there were beliefs and practices on which they differed. There was diversity within the Jesus movement from its inception. And what this means when it comes to our Gospels is that the four different Gospels represent four streams of interpretation on the meaning of the good news of Jesus. They don't all have the same stories, and in the stories they do share in common, they do not always interpret them the same way, or tell them the same way. In fact, they often interpret the meaning of a story in the way they tell the story. Now, I will highlight some of the differences when I give an introduction to each gospel. But I want to jump right now into two stories in the Gospels to illustrate how this works. Both miracle stories where Jesus calms the turbulent waters of the Sea of Galilee. The first miracle story of Jesus stilling the waters occurs in Mark 4:35 through 41. And it is shared by both Matthew and Luke. It's in Matthew 8:23 through 27, and it's in Luke 8:22 through 25. Now, I want to introduce to you a resource that is extremely helpful if you want to compare the gospel stories. I'm sure there are other similar resources available, other versions of this type of thing. The one I have is published by the American Bible Society, and it's called Synopsis of the Four Gospels. And this is the English edition of the American Bible Society, and the text is the revised standard version. I would imagine you could probably get this in the revised standard version, the new revised standard version, and maybe some other translations. I don't know, but this is the copy that I have. It's synopsis of the four Gospels by the American Bible Society. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but what you have in parallel columns the stories that they share in common, and this is the stilling of the storm story, where Jesus calms the waters, the miracle story of calming the Sea of Galilee. That's in Mark 4. And you have the story in parallel columns. You have Matthew's version and Mark's version and Luke's version. All three Gospels have that story, and you can see them side by side, and you can make comparisons. And you can see, by making the comparisons, you can see what the Gospels include, what they omit, what they share in common, how they disagree and differ. And this particular story, this first miracle story of calming the Sea of Galilee, where all three Gospels share the story, in this particular story, they basically emphasize the same meaning. There are differences in the way they tell the story, but basically emphasize the same meaning to the story. Now, that's not always the case, but it is in this one. In the first part of the story, the three accounts basically say the same thing. Jesus and his disciples are crossing the Lake of Galilee, and while they are making their way across, a storm comes up rather suddenly. Luke calls it a storm of wind. Mark and Matthew call it a great storm and add that the waves were powerful. Mark says the waves beat against the boat. Matthew says that the boat was being swamped by the waves. All three accounts say that the boat was filling with water. All three accounts tell us that Jesus was asleep during the storm. Mark, however, says that he was asleep on a cushion, a detail that is omitted in Matthew and Luke. And maybe that particular detail that Mark includes was simply in the oral tradition that was passed on to him, and it was not, and for whatever reason, Matthew and Luke decided to omit it. Or maybe Mark has added that detail to highlight the point that either Jesus is completely oblivious to the danger that they are in, or, more likely, that his faith is so secure that he can sleep through the storm. So, the disciples wake Jesus up. In Mark, what they say is presented as a question. Teacher, do you care if we perish? Which could be interpreted as a rebuke. Teacher, do you care if we perish? In Mark, they address Jesus as teacher. In Luke, Jesus is addressed as master. And it's not framed as a question. In Luke's version, the disciples say, Master, Master. Master is repeated twice to capture their sense of urgency and perhaps their fear. Master, Master, we are perishing. It's a question in Mark. It's a declaration in Luke. And then in Matthew, Jesus is called Lord. And their response is framed as a request. They say, Save us, Lord. We are perishing. So in Matthew, the disciples' response takes the form of a request for salvation, a request for rescue. So to summarize, the title given to Jesus is different in all three versions. In Mark, they say teacher. In Matthew, they say Lord. In Luke, they say Master, Master, repeated twice. And in Mark, the disciples' alarm takes the form of a question. Don't you care we are perishing? With an implied rebuke. Don't you care we are perishing? In Luke, it takes the form of a declaration. We are perishing, they exclaim. And then in Matthew, it takes the form of a request. Save us, Lord. We are perishing. In all three accounts, Jesus wakes up, calms the waters, and speaks to the disciples. But there are differences. And I will talk about the differences as well as offer an explanation of the intended meaning of the story in my next video.